talked about before. I can certainly expand on some of what I said or develop other ideas. But let me start by just throwing it open to questions and comments and reactions and responses and challenges, et cetera, et cetera.
It's the same title.
It's the same title. So I have some things I want to say about anti-Semitism in general, but let's build first on what we did before. So questions, comments, observations. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you have seen also a distinctive American aspect of Holocaust denial, if there is such a thing.
I don't know if it's a very good question. I have stopped really doing active research on Holocaust denial, although if anything happens in the world of the deniers, people rush to let me know about it. No, I don't think there are any overtly distinctive forms that, let me put it this way, you have distinctive forms, you know, an Orban's form of Holocaust denial is different from a Duda's, you know, a Polish form of Holocaust denial, et cetera. But in America, but they all generally go back, on the hardcore denial certainly, they go back to the anti-Semitic motif, the anti-Semitic template of money, power, the Jews' ability. I mean, just think about it. What the deniers are saying is that the Jews got the Allies, who knew it was a lie, to hold the Nuremberg trials. It beggars the imagination in terms of the absurdity of the claim. But as long as you're approaching it from the notion of the stereo, or the, again, I use the analogy I used earlier, the prism through which your view of this is refracted is an anti-Semitic prism. In other words, and it can't help, look, I used to fight against this, but enough conversations with colleagues and others and reading that it's very hard. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's very hard if you're raised in, I'll say American society, because that's the one I can speak for, not to have an element of racism built in. You know, it comes, it's in the weeds, it's in the water, it's in the, you know, it's there. I remember Jesse Jackson, I once heard a talk by Jesse Jackson, the then civil rights leader, now quite old, where he talked about the fact that even he, when he walks down the street in Chicago where he lived, and he sees a group of African-American teenagers coming at him, he sort of pulls his, you know, covers his wallet or something like that. And he said, if I'm even, you know, responding in a racist fashion, how much more so someone who is not? So I think it comes with each of us. And I think the same thing can be said of the anti-Semitism, that when you say to someone that the Jews have made this up, and because they know how to make money, they like to make money, they have no compunctions in making money in a underhanded fashion, it makes sense to them. So that's as far as I would go. Maybe over the course of our conversation, I'll refine that a little more, okay?
Can I ask one
Sure,
question?
sure, follow.
I have had a lot of people who have a different type of encounters with people who have a different kind of soft Holocaust denial. Yeah, sure. I have had a lot of encounters with people who have another kind of soft Holocaust denial than the one you mentioned. Mm-hmm. The kind where they acknowledge that it happened, but in lesser numbers. And these people usually aren't outright anti-Semitic in what they say, but there is a problem with how they talk about the subject, obviously. What do you do with those types of people?
You know,
how do you respond?
the number thing is a very tricky thing. We didn't argue numbers in my trial because we felt that it was, even though I and my lawyers can recognize if someone says it was only 1 million, as opposed, we now know it's probably 6+ million, because so many small graves that we didn't know about have been discovered, particularly in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Europe. But it can get problematic, you know, in that. But when someone, and I don't want to give you a hard number, where someone who says 4.8 million, I think, just doesn't have the right numbers, but someone who says 3 million is a denier. Very often, and this gets tricky, and I'd like to hear people's reactions, on some level, you got to look at how they're coming at it and what they're coming from. If it's a historian who's saying, I don't really believe that there was that massacre over there, we've never found evidence of it or whatever, and consequently they're going to come up with a lesser number, that's one thing. But if they're coming up with this lesser number to say, oh, it wasn't so bad, what if it only had been 2 million? Remember, the tragedy is, yes, the tragedy is the number in the sense that 1 out of every 3 Jews on the face of the earth was murdered. 1, 2, 3, dead. 1, 2, 3, dead, you know. But the issue is not so much the numbers, and it's this element that makes the Holocaust different. You know, there's this debate amongst historians. The historians don't really debate it anymore, the uniqueness of the Holocaust. I think that's yes, you're right. Well, historical strike was something different. Nolte was saying a lot of other things as well as that, but I don't think it leads you anywhere. There are elements of the Holocaust that are very similar to other forms of persecution, and there are elements of the Holocaust that are different. Let me give you 2 examples. Or 1 example. Years ago, when I was in Cape Town, before they had built a Jewish museum, a large Jewish museum and larger Holocaust museum, they had a small exhibit on the Holocaust. And I was speaking to a group of South African police officers who had come to the Holocaust Memorial to have lectures and be trained and talk about prejudice, et cetera, et cetera. But I went through the exhibit. It was a modest exhibit. But anybody here from South Africa? In the exhibit were 2, I don't know if it's still in the museum now, in the reconstituted, but there were 2 pictures hanging side by side. One was a fairly well-known picture of a German doctor with a caliper measuring a little girl's nose to see if it was a Jewish nose or not. Next to it was a picture, which I didn't recognize what it is when I first saw it, the South African probably would, of a little girl, 7, 8, something like that, standing on a chair. And next to her was an official, I think also in a white jacket, because I think they, you know, and the little girl had a pencil through her hair. You know, it was the pencil test. Anybody not from South Africa who knows what the pencil test was? The pencil test was that according to the apartheid regime, if they put a pencil in your hair and it fell out, you were white. If they put a pencil in your hair and it stayed in, you were either colored or black. And families, children were taken away from families in the 60s based on this. That in one family, I think either 1 child or 2 child, who biological children of the parents were taken away because on the basis of the pencil test, it was determined that they were not white. So I think what the museum curators and designers were saying in juxtaposing those 2 pictures are the similarities. There are definitely similarities in form of persecution. I would argue in South Africa it wasn't a genocide as such, though of course there were certainly countless number of black South Africans who were murdered and killed and allowed to die, et cetera. But you needed that population to make you rich, to dig your diamonds and mine your gold and clean your children's bottoms and, you know, clean your house and whatever else it might be. Whereas for the Germans, there was no use for these Jews. Even the Jews who were useful working in factories, there was always more labor than you needed. I mean, to some degree that was true in South Africa as well. But there wasn't going to be a predetermined, we're going to wipe them all out because it'll make our lives easier. Having them there for the white apartheid South Africans made your life possible, the way you wanted to live. So I think there's certain things that are similar, and there's certain things that are different. I can't think of another genocide in which, state-sponsored genocide, where the regime sponsoring the genocide went after an entire group of people, classification of people, more than class, not just within its borders, but outside its borders. I mean, they go, what was the place that, north of the North Pole, right? In Norway, but what's the name of it? Tromsø. To collect 17 Jews. After the landing at Normandy, so you're now being pushed on both, Germans being pushed on both sides. They go there and they go to Rhodes with their 2,500 Jews, I think it's 2,500, something like that, and one of the oldest Jewish populations outside of Judea, Israel, Palestine, call it whatever you want. Because when they went to Rome, they also went to Rhodes. And you're deporting them. Or the Hungarian murders. That's the spring of '44. Parts of Eastern Europe have already been liberated. The Soviets are pushing west. And you're hurrying up. In Auschwitz, they still had building plans through 1947 for building 2 or 3 additional gas chambers. If you've been to Auschwitz, they were on the far side. Mexico, right, exactly. The far side where the smaller gas chambers are, or were, through 47. So there is a commitment to this that I think makes it different. I mean, the Turks were killing Armenians brutally, horribly, I mean, we know. And the idea that we don't have any of the documents is just wrong. We have lots of documents. We don't have all the documents because the Turks sit on them. One of the reasons, by the way, parenthetically, why the Turks sit on these documents, I asked Professor Richard Hovhannissian from UCLA, it's our UCLA friend here, who was one of the experts on Armenian history, why don't the Turks just admit it? You know why? What he explained to me? Huh? No, not retribution, money, reparation. Right. There was so much property owned by Armenians. Armenians were established, you know, that the amount of payment which would have to be made. So it's your national pride and, you know, we don't do those sort of things and that kind of thing. But also that's a factor as well. So I think what we have to do as scholars, and this goes so far from your question, I apologize, but what the hell, is look at these things in a nuanced kind of way. I mean, the debate in the United States, there are a lot of Americans sitting here over recent weeks about concentration camps on our southern border and never again. I don't like the analogies to the Holocaust. I don't think in this case, I'm not saying I don't like all analogies. As I say, there's certain things that are analogous. But I also think that those detention camps, call them what you may, are such a blot on our country and the reputation of our country and the way the kids are being treated, adults as well, but especially children, and not enough food and not blankets and not hugging. And it's just, it beggars the imagination. So when I hear people debating, is it like I say, you know what? That debate, just forget that debate. The thing you should be debating is how to stop this, how to change this. The debate becomes a strategic sort of a cloud, allowing you to get mired in the debate as opposed to what to do with it. So, you know, again, it's the past coming into the politics of the present. So that was a long discourse. I don't remember what your question was, but I hope I answered it. Yes, please.
Yes, many of us are returning. Our mission here, among other things, but is to create a syllabus for anti-Semitism courses.
I have a good book to recommend.
And I'm just curious, in your own personal experience at Emory or elsewhere, if you found any particular materials or approach, because when I look at what we've even observed in the first few days of our time together here, it's a little mind-boggling where to start.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm going to be in residence at the Holocaust Museum next year in Washington. Anybody comes through, come say hello. And one of the things I want to do is create an online reader, not a printed reader, that would articles that would accompany my book, how I structured it. So we should be in touch to talk more about, so we're not recreating the wheel. It is an immense topic. And a lot depends on your audience. What has happened as a result of this recent book and the great interest in this recent book, it just went into its 4th printing yesterday or 2 days ago, And it came out in February. So that's I mean, they're not John Grisham size printing, so don't, you know, but still it's a nice thing. Is that it's reaching non-Jewish audiences. And I think the challenge with non-Jewish audiences, and many of you I know are not Jews, but is to take this seriously. What do I mean by that? I mean that the perception of the Jew, all powerful, well, could pull together it's an academic organization, but still, you know, that it's mainly Jews who are organizing in Oxford and pull to what? Not all, I didn't say only, but a good measure. But that you know, and Jews, you know, the president's daughter and son-in-law are Jewish, and you know, you can do lots. You look at Jews, and you don't see a people that presents as you would expect a victim to present. I'll tell you an incident that I have in the book, an anecdote that I have in the book, where I try to compare and contrast racism and anti-Semitism. Not to say one is worse than the other, but to say they present differently, which often makes anti-Semitism hard to get your head around. I was at a Friday night Shabbat dinner at friends, bunch of us, a couple families all gathering, kids of all ages, teenagers, etc. And it wasn't yet time to sit down at the table and start the meal, so everyone's sort of standing around in the kitchen, getting a little snookered, you know, drinking up, and just a very nice atmosphere. And in the corner of the room, I don't know if there were 10 people there, 12, whatever it was, a mother is having a serious conversation with her teenage son, whom she hadn't seen since he had gone off to school that morning, and he came, you know, so first time they were sort of gathering that day. The night before, Thursday night, he had gone to a party at a local university and at someone's home or a fraternity house associated with a local university where there's been some degree of crime. And she was berating him for his phone went dead. You know, teenagers are biologically stupid. You know, their brains haven't developed. They do things, you'll look at, what the were you thinking, you know? And he had left his phone in the car, his phone was there, whatever it was, he didn't call her and let her know, you know? So she was berating him, and he was trying to reassure her, and he said, Ma, you don't get it. We left the party, well, true, we left late, but there were 4 of us guys together, and as we walked out, a police car drove by, and he followed us very slowly to the car so nothing would happen. And then when we got in the car, he followed us till we drove out of the neighborhood. And he was saying this to reassure his mother. And I was thinking of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor's, in one of her decisions, she refers to the talk that every brown parent and black parent has with their child. You know, say sir and say, you know. And I was thinking, if he had been a black kid, or a brown kid, Hispanic, and his mother's the same, that wouldn't have been reassuring. That's not the information you would have given to say, oh, everything was all right, the policeman followed us. All right, my eye, you know? So I think, you know, it's not just class. I mean, people look at Jews and they see wealthy. Any of you going to spend any time in London, is a very good exhibit. I think it's still up. Any Londoners here? And they've extended it. It's worth going to see it. Go to Camden Town anyway. It's like a vestige of funkiness in 2 blocks in London that are still funky, maybe more than 2 blocks. But the London Jewish Museum is there, and they have a very provocative exhibit on Jews and money, which they've done something interesting I like very much. Through the exhibit on the walls, they have the curator's comments. Should we be doing this exhibit? Is this a good thing? Is this, you know, so the ambivalence. But, you know, and different, in one part of the exhibit, they have 4, I think it's Victorian era, pretty sure, portraits of very leading Jews, Jews in the community. Very beautiful, beautifully dressed, very, in an honorable kind of nice portraits. Then you turn the corner and there are these 4 anti-Semitic portraits, not of the same people, but so disgusting and horrible. It's a very provocative exhibit. Well, one of the places in the exhibit, they have something which I sort of went, duh, where they talk about Jews' earning power. And they point out that right now the wealthiest people in the United Kingdom of an ethnic subgroup are Indians. But they also make the point that if you control for education, Jews are exactly where they should be. In other words, there is the more education, the more likely you are to have a better position. And because there's such an emphasis in the Jewish community on education, that it works out that way. So, but that doesn't matter. I'm giving you facts. I'm giving you logic. The outside world looks at Jews and sees power and money and says, "What are they talking about? What are they complaining about?" And that colors it. Let me just follow one other thing, especially in light of what we saw in Panorama. And I don't know if you're following, if you had time this morning between waking up, eating, and coming here and listening to me, et cetera, et cetera. But Twitter and Facebook is just filled with reactions to yesterday's Panorama thing. If you haven't seen it, I think you can go on the BBC website. It's worth seeing. But on the right, like the murderer in Pittsburgh, or the murderer in San Diego, or the former Army officer arrested in Arkansas with an arsenal in his house and anti-Semitic literature and lists of synagogues of leading Jews, and lots of other places, Charlottesville, that the Jew is not white. Well, as I said, what was the guy in Pittsburgh yelling as the SWAT team was bringing him down? You will not destroy the white race. The killer, according to the police, the killer in San Diego was saying the same thing to them. He's not going to let them destroy the white. So in their minds, they aren't white. But if you go to the left, the progressive left, such as the people depicted that we saw yesterday in the Labor Party, not all of them, but certainly those we saw depicted, their view of prejudice is, again, using the prism analogy, is refracted through a prism that has three facets: ethnicity, class, and power. They look at Jews and they see people who, if not white, they can pass as white. Though there are lots of Jews of color. I've just come from Israel, where over 50% of the population of Israel would be considered people of color. And some of them you don't even have to, Ethiopians, you don't even have to put the quotation marks around. But certainly Mizrahi Jews and other Jews. But from their perspective, the Jews have the choice of how to depict themselves, and they are wealthy. Ipso facto, from that perspective of prejudice, they have power. If you have power, you can't be a victim of prejudice. It's impossible for you to be a victim of prejudice. Therefore, what are you talking about? A conference on anti-Semitism? Give me a break. And then you add another element, which we heard from Corbyn last night in the Panorama show. Me? To quote that great American philosopher and observer of human nature, Miss Piggy, moi? Moi? Me? Prejudice? I have been a lifelong fighter against prejudice, any form of prejudice. My mother demonstrated at Cable Street. That was the anti-fascist demonstrations in the 30s in London. You're accusing me? So it's oxymoronic for you to claim to be a victim. It's oxymoronic for you to accuse me of being a perpetrator. So the two, it doesn't work. So yes, you've been dying here to say something.
So I have two questions.
I'm probably the only person in this place who could shut you up for 5 minutes, right?
I think I've been pretty quiet.
I know you have been. You've behaved, but I like to give you a hard time.
I know. So I was going to ask you a question, but now that you're talking about race in the United States, so for the Jewish community, or for any community, I think if you have power, you can define who you are. When you're limited in power, people define who you are. So on the one hand, Jews were killed for not being white, and now in the United States in particular, Jews are being perceived as white, and I think Jewish people are internalizing their whiteness at an interesting level. In Canada, Jews were never really white, and they're still not white, even though we're, the Jewish population of Canada and the United States are similar, but white identity is different. So as the Jews become more assimilated and perhaps distant from their culture and understanding who we are as a people and how we identify as a people, they're assuming maybe more of an American identity, which is highly racialized. And what's also interesting, I think, in the United States, there's sort of this gap emerging for all sorts of reasons between American Jewish identity and Israeli national identity and other Jewish diasporic communities. How is American racism, or the social construction of the American kind of racial formation, and Omi and Wynot talks about, how is that impacting on Jewish identity in the United States, and how that is maybe impacting on
Oh my
Israel
God, that's a whole conference you just designed there. I'm just going to take a stab at certain aspects of it. I think there are a lot of Jews in the United States, and not just in the United States, in the UK too. There's been a number of articles in today's Jewish Chronicle about, who is it, Hopkins, Katie Hopkins, is that her name? Who is a flaming racist and a flaming anti-Muslim, and has talked about, I don't know if she's talked about immigrants or she's talked about Muslims as cockroaches. And that's a Nazi-like depiction, you know. In Eternal Jew, at one point, there's a famous scene where they pick up a bag of flour or some sort of rice, whatever it is, and the rats come out, and that's used to depict the Jews, you know. And there are some Jews who are not, I wouldn't say lots of Jews and many Jews, but she's been speaking in some Jewish gatherings, homes, small organizations, etc. Because the assumption is, well, she's anti-Muslim and we're under attack by Muslims. And what the article is saying is, first of all, you shouldn't be doing this just in and of itself. And second of all, if you don't think that after she's finished with the Muslims, she's not going to turn on you, or she's creating an atmosphere, a world in which prejudice and hatred is so acceptable. But I think there are Jews, not a lot, not a majority, certainly not the organizational structure, but there are some Jews who have sort of hunkered down and looked for allies in all the wrong places. I think that's, you know, go ahead.
No, okay, thank you. So now going back to the academic stuff and denial. So you speak about a certain type of Holocaust denial. So we were discussing in the conference the rise of sort of the extreme left, the extreme right, and political Islam's anti-Semitism and the attack on the democratic center. Going into the academic world, I would argue, and other scholars have argued, there's a more sophisticated type of revisionism. So people like, in my view, Timothy Schneider's book on the Bloodlands. So he's not a Holocaust revisionist.
Not at all.
But he's saying, in a way, the Holocaust happened, it's horrible. But something similar happened over there, and it's sort of like a geographical, I would argue, a geographical argument that's sort of revisionist. It sort of equalizes.
Though he does say in Bloodlands, after I challenged him exactly as you did, and he made me go back and look at the section in Bloodlands, where he says what Stalin did was horrific. And anybody who doesn't have an idea of what Stalin did, particularly to the Ukrainian population, he made them eat the seed corn. What does that mean? He guaranteed that the following year there would be starvation. They don't have food to eat, let them use the seed corn that you set aside so that you'll have something to plan for the following year. I mean, you know, it wasn't done on, I want to wipe out a certain ethnic group. It was done that these were the peasants and get rid of them. I think, Timothy, I don't want to get into the weeds about a particular book because many people haven't read it.
So say academic revision.
Yes,
is that a threat?
I think what we're having in the academy in certain cases is somewhat of a, I call this is a little bit glib, and I know I'm being taped, so don't take this too seriously, a McCarthyism of the left, where what is acceptable and what is not acceptable to be said, or students at good schools, along with faculty at good schools, saying, well, we're not going to allow certain things to be said because it makes some students feel uncomfortable. I find that very dangerous. Now, I'm not saying that we should be inviting people on campus to make students feel uncomfortable. I don't think David Duke should be invited, and I don't think David Irving should be invited. But we know how the campus works, and there are many people here associated with campuses, that it's that anomaly where, you know, the president can't control who gets invited. People get invited by groups, and if they're legitimate groups, you know, you can, in most cases, invite them. But there are those who are arguing we shouldn't allow people to come on who make us feel uncomfortable. Now, I'm not arguing for, giving David Duke a platform, and I think if he came, I would be out there protesting, et cetera. But sometimes we have to, you can't do that because it gets very dangerous. The minute you start saying who can come and who can't come. Like there's certain people, some people are working BDS. Some people are saying we shouldn't allow people who support. Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to end up with the other end as well. So I think you're right in that certainly within the Jewish community, there's a lot of short-sighted thinking going on that can be very troublesome. But I do think American Jews have been completely, again, to borrow the British term, gobsmacked by what happened, because they didn't really expect this at all, even though it was emerging. Yeah, let's go down and around. Okay.
So I just wanted to get back to the Jewish identity thing just for...
To the what?
The Jewish identity thing, return just for a little bit, just because I think it ties into the academic situation. So just like, okay, on a personal level, so I'm from Georgia, right? So
where?
Athens.
Okay.
Yeah. But I went to school in like the rural parts, right? So growing up Jew in the South, I've heard pretty much everything under the sun in terms of like anti-Semitic jokes, comments, whatever, right? So I'm like,
you got pennies thrown at you and.
Yeah, actually, yeah. And those are by my friends, right? And so
get new friends.
Yeah. So basically, my point is like I'm completely desensitized to any verbal thing, right? Like at this point, I just don't care, and I know a lot of other people, feel the same way. And I think with my generation, in general, we're pretty cynical, and either really pro PC, like politically correctness, or you're really against it, right? And I kind of fall into the against it because I think it's whatever. But when you have that kind of thought and that attitude, mixed with the fact that I think there are like kind of two types of Jews in America, right? From America, something about that. You have people who immigrated like a long time ago who have like in the 1800s who have grown up and are now kind of like waspy Jews, right? Like they have forgotten kind of identity. They were really worried about kind of assimilating into white American culture, and we're pretty white passing, so it fits. They don't like we don't really help ourselves in the sense of distinguishing. And like my friends, I always joke that like I'm off-white, right? Because I still get white privilege, but people who are on the right and everything don't view me as white, right? Like I get racist things thrown at me in Georgia. And so when you're talking about the academic issues, right? Like especially the existence of Israel, and then to some extent, I haven't dealt with Holocaust denial personally. When you have people who don't take these matters seriously, because either especially at our age, like we're cynical about it, or they're like, oh, it's just some other white person. Like, how do you really, I don't know, how do you approach these topics to a group that may not even kind of like believe in their own side?
You mean a Jewish?
Yeah, yeah.
Look, I think it a lot depends. What do they say in social work? You start where the client is at. You start where your position where your client is. First of all, I'm not sure that Jews who came before the 1880s, and I think a lot of it has to do somewhat with class, somewhat with degree of Jewish association. I know Jews who have been here for, parents came at that time and who were strongly identified. So I'm not sure that breakdown still works. I think a little bit of a history lesson. Things changed in the late 60s in America. Not just in America, certainly 68, you had throughout Europe, you had the 68 uprising, whether it was in Germany, whether it was in Paris, whether it was in Poland. I don't know, and if you saw the exhibit at Polin at the museum in Warsaw in the 1968 uprising, student uprising, which led to an outbreak of, or allowed the Polish communists to engage in direct anti-Semitism, and many Poles left. So in the late 60s, you had, in part, inspired by the Black Power movement, as it was called, the Black Identity movement, whatever, a sense that our minority identity is not something to, well, certainly people of color, blacks, Hispanics can't hide it, but it's not something to be still ashamed of, but to be proud of. You had Stonewall. We're just now marking the anniversary of Stonewall, which was the uprising at the bar of, started apparently with the drag queens. And then with the gay community fighting, gay patrons fighting back. You had the women's movement. You had, you know, America has this Horatio Alger myth that start from nothing but pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that's really what counts. And suddenly you had all these groups, African Americans, Hispanics, women, gays, Jews, saying, hey, we have suffering in our background, and that's not something to be hidden or set aside. And where, you know, again, black, brown people didn't have a choice, but we're not gonna be in Jewish terminology would say shashtil, don't make a fuss kind of people, you know. And we're going to be proud of who we are, and we're going to identify openly. And in the Jewish community, that's when you began to get a real grappling with the Holocaust. By the way, in Germany, the same thing, certainly not amongst Jews. There were no Jews, there were hardly any Jews left in Germany. They killed them all. But, and I don't say that glibly, but it was young Germans in '68 who had watched the Auschwitz trials and the Eichmann trials on television, et cetera, who suddenly said, and had grown up where, certainly in West Germany, where everyone, from the dog catcher to the diplomat, said, oh, my parents were on the Eastern Front fighting, you know, if they were all the Germans who claimed their parents were on the, or Germans who claimed, Opa war kein Nazi, right, you know, Grandpa was no Nazi, they wouldn't have lost on the Eastern Front. So nobody had any responsibility, but that changed in '68. In the late 60s. It changed dramatically. So there was a much more, we've gone through 3-4 generations or 3-4 decades of an honesty about a past, whether in the United States, whether in parts of Europe, et cetera, and an honesty about persecution. And I hate this is speaking personally, I hate the attack on PC, because PC says, it's wrong to call someone, a black person, by the N-word, to call a Jew a kike, to call a woman a slut, to whatever it might be. And bravo to the United States soccer team. Not women's soccer team, but soccer team, you know? The women's soccer team and we have the men's soccer team. But that was just an aside. So we had these generations, culminating with an African-American, mixed race person, but certainly someone who presented to Americans as, looked at and saw an African-American in the White House. And then came the response, the pushback. And with it, a populism, an anti-globalism that's been paralleled in Europe as well. And anti-Muslim, anti-refugee, this whole replacement theory. So I think we're getting this pushback against what we saw from the late 60s through the first decades of the 21st century. And it's not overtly anti-Semitic. It's more overtly racist, it's more overtly anti-Muslim, but it comes from the same people who tend towards, you know, looking at the Jew as the non-white. And the irony is that it's coming from the right, from the far right, but it's also coming from the, as we saw in the Labor Party, from the far left. And in the Labor Party and that far progressive left, and I'm not saying everybody on the far progressive left is engaging in it, it's the last vestiges, inheritance of the Soviet Union. You know, the Soviet Union, who started this myth in '74 and got it passed through the United Nations, Zionism is racism. You know, again, you can disagree with Israel's policies, but the idea that only the Jews couldn't have a national identity, you can say that it's been carried out wrong, you can say that there's been human rights violations, you can say all those things and not be wrong. But to ipso facto declare it racism. So we're seeing that pushing back. We're seeing a populism And I'm not against patriotism. I think to be patriotic about your country, I'm very grateful to what America's given to my family, and what we've done to add to it, but the opportunities that have been given, et cetera. But I think on some level we're seeing that pushback. So all those, and in that cauldron, that mess, that it's like a whirlpool, sort of different emotions. History has taught us that Jews get ground up. And I wouldn't talk about anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right. It's the same. Oh, yes, you have it emanating from there, but it's exactly the same form of anti-Semitism. That's the interesting thing. Sometimes you get a racism on the left and you get a racism on the right, and you can have in both places, but it presents differently. Or sexism, whatever it might be. But here, look, think about it. I'll give you two examples. A few weeks ago in Detroit, there was a dyke march, lesbians. And the Jewish lesbian groups in the march, some of whom wanted to march with the Israeli flag, some of whom wanted to march with a gay flag with a Jewish star, were told they couldn't march because the flags were too political or whatever. And they were standing on the sides, and a bunch of neo-Nazis had come to protest the march. Now, I want to argue that 4 or 5 years ago, they wouldn't have the guts to have come out so openly. Now they feel it's okay. But they came, and when they saw the Israeli flag and the gay pride flag with the Jewish star, they urinated on it. So it was this mix of right and left. The other example is David Irving, the guy who sued me in court, a flaming right-winger, and there's nothing about the Labor Party he likes. You know, someone who has said that he thought the news should be read on the BBC on by dinner-jacketed gentlemen, and that the news of, the important news should be read by dinner-jacketed gentlemen, the unimportant news by women, and the news of criminals and drug busts, and then he named a very well-known newsreader who's from the Caribbean, by black people. You know, he's a racist. He's an overtly racist person. But he said, oh, I'm impressed with Jeremy Corbyn. What's he impressed with Jeremy Corbyn about? His anti-Semitism, you know, so it's a coming together on the two sides. So I don't know if I got to everything you said, but.
Yeah, I'm not really sure my question.
Okay, let's keep going around. Others, yes, in the corner. Tell me who you people are, so I know who people are.
I'm Janelle Green. I go to Claflin University, which is an HBCU in South Carolina.
I know about it.
So my question is, I'm wondering what the most effective way you found to deliver the message of anti-Semitism as it being on the rise in the United States is to minority and populations. Because you did touch on the idea that in a lot of communities of color and minorities in America, there's a sort of disbelief.
What are those Jews complaining about?
Right, because there's a belief that Jewish people have money and power and influence because of certain theories that come from different groups. So how do you?
I think it's a very important question. I recently spoke at a large graduation at Brandeis University, where there's a large Jewish student population, but not only. And I say this not just there, but I say it in a lot of places. First of all, you can't fight one ism without fighting all isms. And I say that to Jews who are mainly, I mean, you're always going to be more concerned about the ism that's going to harm you and your family and your friends and your neighbors, people of your background, whatever it is. So if you're gay, you're always going to be most concerned about homophobia. If you're black, you're going to be most concerned about racism, Jew, anti-Semitism. But if you say, I only care about one, then you're, first of all, do it strictly on a self-interest level. I'm not saying this is the most important reason, but if you want to convince people, you sort of start out on the self-interest kind of thing, because that's how we are. That's how we're programmed. That's in our DNA or whatever. If they're starting with one group, they're going to get to another group. Look, Dylan Roof and the guy in Pittsburgh, Dylan Roof, the killer, the murderer at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, they all read the same websites. They all believed in the same thing. The thought that they're going to go after one and not the other is I guess it's wrong to say whistling Dixie, but I'll say his whistling Dixie. Meaning, you know, it's a fool's errand. So I think that's one thing. And I believe in it morally, and I believe in it strategically. And I think the other thing to understand, and I'm very careful about analogies to the Holocaust. I think it's analogized both by people anxious to remember the Holocaust and people who think it's been remembered too much. But I'm very careful. As a historian, I'm very careful. But Jews are very much aware that when the Nazis, you know, and as we heard last night or yesterday afternoon from Professor Patterson, they weren't anti-Semitic because they were racist. They were anti-Semites, and all else flowed from there. That these things get mixed up with one another. When I see someone that I think is different, if I'm dividing people into us and thems, not just us and thems in terms of neighbors and celebrations and traditions and cultures, but us and them in terms of danger, I put the two together. I don't know if that will work. I think that there's also a need on part of the Jewish community. Certain segments of the Jewish community are very aware of racism. But I think that there's a need to understand it as not just that something is inherently wrong, and I think Jews have understood that it's inherently wrong, but also that don't think it's just to them. But it may start with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. It may start with the African Americans, but it's not going to end with the African Americans. It may start with the Muslims, but it's not going to end with the Muslims. If you have a society with hatred in it, it's dangerous. The other thing, and what I haven't said yet, and I should have said maybe earlier, but I don't think any healthy democratic society can tolerate having anti-Semitism in its midst and remain a healthy democratic society. I think the same thing about racism, but for different reasons. The reason for anti-Semitism is rooted, as you've heard already this week, and you'll hear more through the end of this conference in this institute, is rooted in conspiracy theories. And conspiracy theories say create distrust in judges, in the FBI, in the banks, in the police, in the school system, in in everything. If I don't feel that there's something I can trust there, then it's a sort of downfall of democracy. Now, I think democracy can be very flawed, no question about it. And no one knows this in the United States. No one knows this better than the African American community. But nonetheless, it's better than the alternatives, as we're seeing in certain cases today in the United States. So I don't know if that would work. I don't know if that'll be sufficient, especially in today where there's such a feeling, justifiably so, of urgency about racism in the African American community and the way it's presented and the way it's been expressed and the way, see, the other thing that's so troublesome and you know, I think that I hold, just like I hold Jeremy Corbyn accountable for lots of the anti-Semitism that has emerged here in the UK, I hold Donald Trump accountable for much of the anti-Semitism and certainly racism that has emerged. I think he is a racist, but I don't know whether he's an anti-Semite or not. But that's not the question. The question is not the thoughts, but the deeds. And I think the deeds have emboldened a division amongst people and a resentment amongst a certain segment of the population, certainly a white segment of the population. And I think that is very dangerous. I recently heard of an incident, I read about it in the newspaper, and I was just the day before I was going to meet with the DC City Council because there'd been a number of incidents of anti-Semitism. The DC City Council, as you probably know, has I think a majority, but if not a very significant, I think it's a majority of African Americans on it because of the nature of the makeup of DC. And they'd asked me to come and talk to them about anti-Semitism. How could they put their heads around it? How could they understand it? And just a few days before I had come, I think the day before I came, there was a story in, I think on the Washington Post, of a middle school in DC. Now, most of the schools, public schools in DC, have a majority African American population. This one happened to have a far more diverse population, a larger segment of Caucasians, of whites. And kids were playing football at recess. And there was some altercation that began between a white kid and a couple of black kids. I have no idea about what, nobody knows about. But the white kid used the N-word. And then he said, and you can call, this is a middle school. So what is he, 6th, 7th, 8th grade? Does it go to middle school? You can call me racist, but I don't care. He heard that from someplace. He heard that from home. Because that's not, maybe the N-word he picked up other places, but I think both the N-word and certainly you can call me racist, but I don't care, you hear from home. They can call me, I don't care what they say about me, that kind of thing. That's the PC I'm talking about. Because then it leads to other things. No genocide ever began with actions. Every genocide began with words. That doesn't mean everybody who engages in those words is going to ipso facto engage in genocide. But no genocide began with actions. So, but I think that if we're going to fight against one kind of hatred, you've got to fight against the other because the enemies don't see the difference. That would be mine. Yes, in front of you. I'll get around, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Milan. I came from Slovakia. I created the historical first course about denial, which was based on your books.
Oh, thank you.
And it's a great honor to give you a question.
Thank you very much.
And my question is what Dr. Small mentioned, the critical situation at universities. In Slovakia, the historians fight each other. The lawyers fight each other. My definition of antisemitism is better than you, and something like that. And in the shadow, the neo-Nazi party raises. Today is the second biggest party in our parliament, and next year we have an election. And what can we do? What shall I do?
You know, I can't. It's too serious a problem for me to say, here's what you should do, 1, 2, 3, 4. First of all, that would be wrong. And it would be a certain, I don't know, national super, what do I can't tell you what to do in Slovakia, but I can tell you that what you're facing, just like we heard a question, I don't think she's here, from the young woman sitting over there, who came from, I think, the Ukraine. I was just in Poland. I've been to Hungary a lot. I've been to the Czech Republic, less so to Slovakia. It's really problematic. Because this hatred, this emerging or empowered anti-Semitism that is so associated with the far right is getting stronger, in part against Muslim immigrants, refugees, even in a place like Poland where they took in 7,000 people. Tiny. And yet that was used, the party used that, Duda's party, the current party, PIS, used it to build their majority. So we're facing a very difficult situation with attacks from the left and then from the right, whether it's the Steve Bannons of the world or whether it's, I don't know who else it is, in various countries with this anti-democratic. It's, look, even Orban in Hungary, anybody here from Hungary? Orban in Hungary has talked about illiberal democracy. Meshuggah, you know, crazy. Dangerous, dangerous. But it means we'll control the press and we'll control the judges and we'll get rid of universities which have open thinking like CEU. But we're still a democracy because you vote, but you can rest assured I will win the next time. You know, so Let me keep going. I'll come all the way, yeah.
I am from Lithuania, and we have a long time political denial, genocide, Holocaust. We have Center of Research, Lithuanian people's genocide and resistance. And this center make big room of denial by 30 years. And we have heroes, we have many things, monuments, street names, school names, and
Street names and school names to people who were Ukrainian nationals.
Lithuanian
who
killed Jews.
Right.
It is documented. And when we try discuss, we must discuss with not with scientists, the historians. We must discuss with Lithuanian Foreign Ministry and Lithuanian Defending Ministry, and sometimes Lithuanian policy. It is not academical discussion.
Mm-hmm. It's political. It's a political discussion.
Yes, academical discussion we lost about 20 years ago when Professor David Katz lost his cathedra in Vilnius University. And Lithuanian Foreign Ministry can tell many good things about, right things about the Holocaust. All is right, but no names. Who killed? Germany. What Germany? And in Lithuania, Jews was killed not in concentration camps. They was killed
by Lithuanians
near the towns. And,
right.
There are more than 200 modern places, and we have such with prisoners. Jewish was killed about 220,000. Prisoners was killed 160, and they say that some different things say that Jews was not oppression began autumn 1941. Was arrested and killed was only communists. I see
it's a rewriting. It's a rewriting of history. It's a rewriting.
Yes, rewriting history, and it is if I show documents. I am a journalist. I write articles. Show documents and defending ministry officers write about this propaganda. I strike against Lithuanian state. I write them, okay, if you think that I make international law, we can make a peace agreement. You remove idiots from defending ministry and I don't fight against it. But it is became international. Because when go to Lithuania, Papa Francisco, maybe you know it, they show for Vilnius ghetto. I write many papers about Vilnius ghetto, and Nazis show Vilnius ghetto too. It is a big ghetto, good functional, but no don't show more than the sites. And Popayka don't show murder site in Plunge, where was 70 Jewish girls baptized, raped, and murdered. Don't show what to do. And they erect monuments in the United States for For example, Ramanauskas, Vanagas in Chicago, in this.
Okay, let me stop.
It is go from Lithuania. They spread that denial, and I don't know what.
Thank you. What you are describing, and again. War, ending the war and all that. But he moved from the north, he left the north, where he was in the army, to the south, to fight for what? States' rights for what? You know, so it's the history wars, let me put it this way, especially to the historians and the students of history here, the history wars are contemporary. And they don't control just how we remember the past, but they control the societies we're building today. And I think that's a lot of what you're talking about. I'm not going to say, and I'm going to just move to this side now so I don't get accused of favoring the right. But I'm not a political scientist or a politician to come and say this is what they should do or should be done in Slovakia, in the Ukraine, in Germany, in Poland, Hungary, whatever. But I think it's something that people have to take very seriously and not just see it as a fight over some arcane aspect of history. Oh, there they go fighting whether XYZ was a murder. It has to do with who we are going to be in the future, if not today. So I don't have an answer for you because it would be, I think it would be disingenuous of me sitting in the United States or flipping in, you know, in and out of countries as I do, but to say this is what you should do. But I can tell you that what you are fighting is not just the history wars, but the nature of the society that will be there. Let me keep going here, and then I'll get you in the back, yeah.
Hi, my name is Dorot. I'm not in academia.
That's all right. We like people who are not. They got their heads screwed on straight. You know?
Before I live in a small town in Turkey, and I started an NGO to help the Syrian refugees that have become 10% of my town, to teach them to Turkish, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, but my question goes, your talk earlier about the origins of anti-Semitism according from the New Testament, which you know, is just today the same thing but a different sweater, so to speak.
I heard a good analogy. Let's give you an analogy. From Professor Alan Johnson, who you saw in the Panorama show last night, he compared a recent article. It's a very good article on labor anti-Semitism in Fathom magazine, which is an online magazine, very much with hundreds of examples of what we heard a little bit of last night. But he describes anti-Semitism as a piano on which different tunes are played. And different people play tunes. So it might be a medieval Catholic preacher, it might be Voltaire who hates the church, it might be Marx who hates all religion, it might be the Nazis, but it's the same instrument with different modified tunes being played, so that's, yeah.
So my question is, before the New Testament, where did anti-Semitism come from?
Well, before, you know, this is getting into a historian's war, and I would not bore you with that, but there are some historians who look at ancient Egypt, you know, Alexandria and things, and they see anti-Semitism there. I'm not a specialist in the ancient world, so and I don't know it as well as certainly I know the modern world or the history of the modern world. But I would argue that what happened in the ancient Greco world, you know, Alexandria, for example, was more of a fight about different ethnic groups, a different group in your midst who didn't disappear. But it didn't have what you get. Again, and we heard this from Professor Patterson yesterday, what you get in the early Middle Ages to late Middle Ages is a demonization of the Jew. What we're talking about and what makes the punching up, remember punching down, punching up? The punching down, they're inferior and I got to keep them down because they're going to bring me down. They'll go to the kids will go to my school, the schools won't be as good. They'll move into my neighborhood won't be as good. I mean, you know, push down, push down. The part of that person who's, because as I say, racist and anti-Semite are usually the same. The pushing up is, they're like the demon, and they're all over, and what was distinctive about, and continues in theology to be distinctive about the demon? A, the demon is the only one who can harm God, and B, the demon disguises himself so that you don't know you've encountered the demon until he's come and gone. So change demon to George Soros, change demon to Rothschild, change demon to the, you know, that you Jew working behind the scene kind of thing. That's the punching up, the conspiracy theory element. So it has migrated, used to be only part of the Western world. It certainly has migrated into not all, but much of the Islamic world. The Prime Minister of Malaysia was, you know, just speaking at Cambridge and engaging in overt anti-Semitism, and he has engaged in overt anti-Semitism. So I describe and compare anti-Semitism to a herpes virus. Now, if you've ever known anyone who's had a herpes virus, you know that and now there's medication that to some degree it responds to, but up until very recently, it couldn't be cured. It would lie dormant in your body, and it would come out in one of two situations. Stress, so the day before you're going for an interview for a job, you get a herpes sore or something like that, day before your wedding, and a hospitable environment. You have a sore in your body or an infection in your body, and you know the virus migrates to there and finds it a hospitable environment to prosper. So you've had what's being described as shape-shifting. Anti-Semitism has the ability to shape-shift in a way that other isms generally don't. Racism is always they're lesser, they're bad, they're unaccomplished. They didn't get, you know, they didn't get where they go by deserving it. They're going to bring us down. They're going to, you know, et cetera. It's not as smart, not as good, not as hard working in America. The stereotype, shiftless and lazy, all, you know, prejudicial. Think about the word prejudice. Anybody ever think about the etymology of the word prejudice? Prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. So I have a colleague who says, you meet the stereotype in front of your nose when the person is still 2 blocks away. So it changes, yet it remains the same, if that's your question. It's in the back, yes?
I'm Gabriel Noah Brown. I did a book called The Case Against
Holocaust. I like your book very much.
Thank you for your support.
And your reader on BDS is excellent. Excellent. Read it. It's really a terrific book.
Well, it's riveting to hear you address these questions. Thank you for being here. Speaking of BDS, is BDS anti-Semitic, and what about anti-Zionism more broadly? Not forgetting that some Jews support BDS and even call themselves anti-Semites?
Right. First of all, I think the notion that someone can be of a group and therefore is not necessarily going to be prejudicial towards that group is wrong. We know women who are sexist. We know African Americans who have engaged in a form of, or, you know, if only they would, if only boys would hike up their pants or whatever it might be, everything would be solved. And we know Jews who have absorbed anti-Semitism, absolutely. You know, and so the idea, in fact, the idea of the self-hating Jew, I think is not, in my book, I talk about not the self-hating, but the self-loving Jew. The Jew, particularly on the left, who says, you know, I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm going to bravely speak out on these things because I'm the brave Jew, whatever. It's like Howard Jacobson wrote a book, The Finkler Question, which won the Man Booker Prize a couple years ago, about 10 years ago, in which he talks about Jews who discovered they were Jews when it came time to criticize Israel. Now, on the Israel issue, and do so bravely. I'm so brave, I'm
Proud to be ashamed.
yes, there you go, right. I don't know who coined that. You know who coined that? Was it, I think you're right, I have to ask him. But it's a great read. It's the only novel I've read that I've ever I shouldn't say that, I have some of Faulkner's and others I've underlined, but I've underlined and annotated, you know. Now on Israel, it's a very crucial question, and you've given us tremendous, tremendous material to work on this question, and very balanced and fair. And Alan Johnson was saying it, he says it in this Fathom piece. If you want to get a sense of what the whole problem with labor is and the connection to Israel, look at this Fathom piece with loads, you know, he apologizes that I give you so many examples, but he says the examples drive home the piece. One can be critical of Israel, of Israeli policies, in the extreme, and not be an anti-Semite. One can be critical of American policies and not be anti-American. Absolutely. One can be critical of, one can call the settlements or the shuvim or whatever you want to call them on the West Bank occupation and not necessarily be an anti-Semite. You want to hear criticism of Israeli policies? Read Haaretz, the Israeli daily. Go to the Knesset. And the one place in the Middle East where you have open debate, and listen to what the opposition is saying, and you'll hear criticism. Criticism of Israeli policies is not anti-Semitism. It's when, my argument is, when you begin to say that, or say that the state of Israel has no right to exist. The question has to be, why? Why? And some people say, well, it's a theocracy and theocracies you shouldn't have theocracies anymore. Well, then count for me how many Muslim states there are, 22, 23, something like that. It's not that necessarily you should have theocracies, but if you're only going to talk about Israel as a theocracy and not talk about other theocracies, then I have to ask, where's this myopia coming from? Or I'll give you another example that I recently heard from someone who was virulently against the existence of the State of Israel. His argument was that the State of Israel was created in a sin. What was the sin? The expulsion of the Palestinian Arabs. Now, truth be told, there were Palestinian Arabs who left because they were told on the radio and by imams and others, leave now, and you will come back in a few days and you will inherit the Jews' orchards and their homes and their business. It will all be yours, but get out so we can eliminate them and we don't have to worry about not harming you. So some left because of that, and some left because they were pushed out by Jewish fighters and Jewish forces. We know that. So this person said to me, Israel was founded in sin because these people were pushed out and therefore doesn't have a right to exist. So I said, you know what, let's historically contextualize what you're saying. And let's start with the United States. The United States has two eminent sins in its founding: slavery and the treatment of Native Americans. No getting around it. You don't want the United States? Let's go to Canada and the treatment of what's called the First Nation in Canada. It's not what they call them, the indigenous population. Horrific treatment. And the schools they set up to strip them of their culture and forced adoptions and things like that. Okay, you know what, North America, let's go to Australia and the treatment of the Aborigines. Or let's go to New Zealand and the treatment of the Maoris. I'm not talking about Syria. Some people say, well, why aren't you focusing more on Syria? Because I don't think that's a good comparison. Or even China or Myanmar, you know, where, but Western or democratic countries, not all Western, which you know, I'm not saying that because they all have sins in their founding that makes them right. God forbid, no. But what I'm saying is, does that ipso facto mean you don't have a right to exist if there's so much else in your history? So I think that that's part of it. And I think also when you see a myopic view of the situation where all the wrong is on one side, Israel has done lots that's wrong. And Israelis will admit it, it's a country of human beings. How can you, anybody says, oh, the IDF never does anything that's wrong, I say, you're crazy. The IDF is made up of people. People do wrong things. And there are policies of the governments which have been very disturbing. But the failure to see a more nuanced situation, the idea that this is the worst human rights abuse in the world, I think is really, it's not that it's way overboard, it's a myopia. You know, I don't know if you saw Isabel Kirshner's article in yesterday's New York Times on how on the West Bank, amongst Palestinians, Judea and Samaria, occupied territory, call it whatever you want, that piece of geography, amongst Palestinian Arabs, much more concerned right now about a mortgage and paying the debts on your, and buying a car and starting a business. It doesn't mean that there aren't human rights abuses, and when people go through checkpoints, it's not going to be a hard, it isn't necessarily a difficult a thing. Not at all, and I'm not diminishing it. But it's when there is this myopia, this singular focus, you have to ask why. Where is it coming from? And I think that that's so important. Again, if you want a nuanced understanding of this work, your work has been really terrific. Shaked.
Following up on Deborah's question, today, and addressing delegitimization of Israel. So today, I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot of universities who teach anti-Semitism, and your focus is on classic anti-Semitism, but addressing modern anti-Semitism and linking it to the delegitimization of Israel. My feel is, and from what I've been collecting a little bit of data and reading, is that first of all, in the universities, it became popular to delegitimize Israel, and this comes with no problem of being on the left. I'm actually more leaning left than right, but the presence in faculties is usually left wing, right wing is between 0 to 15%. So a lot of people I've talked to, professors, doctorate students, are suffering difficulties with if they support Israel, suffering difficulties with their academic careers.
That's right. That's right.
I'm a grad student, thinking about going further with my academic studies. What do you think the future holds for young academics who don't have tenured and don't have how do you think the future looks for somebody who supports Israel and wants to be in the academia?
First of all, I'm a historian. We talk about what was. I'm a historian. Masha, yeah, we talk about what was. So you're always right about what was. I mean, you can explain it differently. And prophecy, after the Talmud says that after the completion of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew scriptures, prophecy was left for children and fools. So I am neither a child nor a fool, you know. But nonetheless, I don't think it. I think that's where you see the pushback. And ironically, when I was in Poland about 10 days ago, I was talking to professors in Poland, and they were talking about the pushback their students are feeling. You know, pushback on, in terms of, you know, in Poland, they're developed in the past 20, 25 years, It's sometimes called the field that Jan Gross of Princeton started with Jedwabne, Neighbors, the book Neighbors. Some of you may know that book about a Polish town where the Poles killed their Jewish neighbors who had lived there centuries, families, while, the Germans didn't do it, the Poles did it. But that the fear is that, and so what's grown up in Poland, young people doing magnificent research on the history of Poland during the Holocaust, towns, individuals, churches, national things, et cetera, et cetera. And now this government doesn't like it. Going back to what you were describing in Slovakia, and where are you? You're Lithuania, and Slovakia, Lithuania, right, and the Ukraine, where she was sitting. There it's different. There is, if you're going to show us to have done bad things, we don't want to, you're not going to get it. I think that the same thing we're going to see in the States, where Israeli students are welcome if they disavow, that's why I call it McCarthyism of the left. Oh, you want to study Mosaic art history, Mosaic Renaissance churches in ancient Palestine, mosaic floors or something. First tell me what you think about your government's policy, And I think it's very, very disturbing. And if we're going to be against it on the right, and we saw it in the American campuses in the 50s and through the early 60s, we've got to be against it on the left too. Okay, let me keep going. And yeah, go ahead. We only have about 5 minutes, so ask quickly. One and then two.
So my question is actually connected to her question about education. I was reading your book, and I was thinking about pedagogy and how to better present ourselves to the audience. And so I found it really interesting and surprising, the epistolary structure.
The letters, right.
And when you write to the non-Jew professor and the Jewish student, and the structure of answer, question and answer,
right.
And how it sort of creates eventually a conversation within the book and with the reader. And that reminded me of the kind of conversations you can have within a classroom. Mm-hmm. So I was interested in knowing how it came to be and why.
Okay, great question. I started to write the book. I wrote an op-ed after the Gaza war for the New York Times on a rise of anti-Semitism. I love jokes about anti-Semitism, and this one was, what's a Jewish telegram? Start worrying, details follow, So it's time to start worrying. I said, I've never been one of those to believe, dear me, the sky is falling, but what I've seen coming out of Gaza and before Gaza and et cetera around it, it leaves me very worried about anti-Semitism. My agent called me and said, where's the proposal? I said, what are you talking about? He said, look at what the response your article is getting and how it's being sent around, that it's #1 email, that, so many different metrics you can look at now and feel good or feel awful. So I said, I don't want to write this book. I don't want to spend 3 years wallowing in the sewers of anti-Semitism. And my agent's a pretty persuasive guy, so I figured the easiest way of getting him off my back was to write the proposal. He sold it. I had to write the book. So I sat down to write the book, and it was boring. I was falling asleep writing it, much less someone to read it. Oh my God, I said, this is going to be in lieu of sleeping pills, And I was doing it country by country, and I realized I knew a lot about different countries, but not enough to really write country specific. I was doing it by trend. It was just awful. And then a friend called me, and she said, letters, try letters, and that's Ta-Nehisi Coates did it recently, Yossi Klein Halevi did it, but that was all before my book came. Letters, we've seen letters for a very long time. So I started out by writing the letter. What I did was I made a composite of 2 people, a student, Jewish student, and a non-Jewish colleague. And here's the irony. Usually you have historical figures speaking fiction. You see The Favorite, you see, different Victoria, whatever the incident might be. It's a historical figure speaking fiction. Here, it's 2 fictional characters speaking what I have heard and what has been said to me over time. So that's how it took form. But I also became very much vested in it because I was intent on writing a book that people would read, on writing a scholarly book. Someone, in fact, came to interview me from a newspaper, magazine, and he said, you've got 30 pages of footnotes there. It's a scholarly book. You resource that, you reference all the things you said, but it's so readable. And I was very pleased by that. because I really want it to be a book that will be read. I mean, it's out in German, it's out in Hebrew, it's coming out in French and Spanish, I believe. Yeah, I want it to be reachable because I think this is a topic we all have to be concerned about. And with it, the rise of other isms, but the rewriting of history, et cetera. So that's in long and short. Okay, next, India.
So you mentioned a little in the first half of your lecture about Vietnam's cooperation with certain right-wing governments, and especially like Hungary's or the Polish law, and also like he also does not have a great history about talking historically accurate things about the Holocaust.
One would say that.
And like when in 2015 he said it was the Mufti.
Mufti who convinced Hitler when, right, which is
Yeah.
ridiculous, right.
And, so I was wondering, what are the implications of this sort of...
I just get, of Netanyahu, okay, I'm only cutting you because I see a lot of anxious people around you, and I know, I stand between you and lunch, and you may like my talking very much, but you like lunch better. I just gave an interview last week to the Times of Israel, which appeared on Monday, and when I posted it, I said, do never give an interview when you're over-caffeinated and underslept, because the filters come down and you speak the truth. I've gotten a very good response, and then some people who want to, you know, I don't know, string me up or not, or maybe less than that, but who are not happy. I am very, and at one point I briefed, when I was in Israel, I briefed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I said the same thing to them, so I'm not, you know. I'm very troubled. Let me back up. I understand realpolitik. I understand that nothing I say will determine whether, you know, there's peace or not peace, whether a population is safe or not safe. I say it, I can say things here. Let me go to lunch and you can all forget what I said. Head of government has a different responsibility. Having said that, I am very disturbed by Prime Minister Netanyahu's outreach to the Poles in terms of their rewriting of the history, outreach to Orban, engaged in overt anti-Semitism, a great fighter against anti-Semitism. Where was he last week? He was in Lithuania. He was, and his comments there. If those are being done for realpolitik reasons, that these are people who will vote in the EU more in Israel's favor, where some of the Western democracies are automatically against it, I understand that. But then don't claim for yourself the mantle of the country that's going to fight on behalf of Jews who are subjected to anti-Semitism anywhere in the world. You can't have it both ways. Back here, yes.
I'm going to defer to Richard.
Okay, Richard.
Well, let me defer to Mark and then add my question, which is, you know, there's...
What's wrong here?
Right.
Go ahead.
There's a fair number of people who say Islamophobia is the new anti-Semitism. So I just want you to comment on that. But
okay, Mark.
Yeah, I'm a scientist, but I'm a man of faith in the Church of England.
You're a scientist?
Yeah, but I'm in the Church of England. So, and I see the Church in England as a source of anti-Semitism, without doubt, in England. The Church in England.
Can you speak up, please?
The Church in England.
I'll repeat it.
The blood libel, the idea that Jewish children were tortured and crucified, and the blood was used in
preparation of matzah.
Bread. And that libel now has been spread around the world, and it's preached regularly in the Arab world, in Saudi Arabia, and also in Turkey, and Rad Salah preaches it, Jeremy Corbyn's friend. And so, can we make the Church in England, or Church of England, take responsibility for this blood libel, as you say, words are what
Words
can.
Okay, let me...
You can take a class action against the Church just to make a point.
Because I was sued, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you what you can do. And the second question, Mark's question was about the blood libel emanating from the Church of England, because the blood libel started in this parts of the world. You're at Norwich, in this part of the world, where the myth that Jews use the blood of a young Christian child and whom they capture and kill, particularly right before Passover, to prepare the leavened bread, the matzah. Now, what is that? That is a reenactment of the crucifixion. When was Jesus killed? And it's Passover time. Passover, that's why Passover and Easter always come out close together. I don't think so. I think at the very least you could ask you could hope that one day the Church of England will take moral responsibility for it. The damage is still the damage. Once you, right, once you let something out of the bag, there's no easily putting it back. Whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's racism, whether it's homophobia, it's very hard to put this back. That's one of the reasons why I worry so much about my country, because so much of these emotions that have come out of the bag. Let me turn to Islamophobia and then take one last question. I don't like the term Islamophobia. I don't think it's the new anti-Semitism. Let me back up for a minute. I think the young person or the older person, any person wearing a kippah should feel as safe walking in the street as the young woman wearing a hijab, as the young African American walking with a couple of friends from the park wearing a hoodie should not be subjected to persecution or attack or profiling by anyone, and particularly people entrusted with the authority to maintain order. I'm against all of those kind of things. They bother me deeply, and don't think that the person who beats up the kid in Berlin, as has happened so often, you know, with wearing kippot, etc., is going to stop on someone else. But having said that, so I am against discrimination of any kind and attacks of any kind on Muslims, as I am against Jews, etc. I don't like the term Islamophobia because I think that there have been certain actions in the world, and I want to say this very carefully, and actually I'm saying it with no time left, and it's a major can of worms that I'm opening. But I certainly don't want to engage in the prejudice that we're here to meet about and talk about and expose. But there are reasons to have a fear of some of the things that are being preached in the name of Islam, whether they're truly Islam or not, whether coming from imams or coming from others. We see that in certain countries. So I think that there is a legitimate right to be concerned about the Islamist extremism is how I call it. I don't call it Muslim extremism because I don't want, or Islam extremism because it's not necessarily the religion, but it's the way the religion is being used. But having said that, I think that to describe it as the new anti-Semitism is to way overstate the historical roots of it, way overstate the ancient quality of it, way overstate the way it has shaped the face of the Jewish community. And to some degree, I find that a disparaging of anti-Semitism. Final question, yes.
So, my name's Robert and I'm Jamaican. So, I'd like to pick up on your last points as well as yours. There seems to be a recurring question about the role that Christianity had in forming anti-Semitism. It wasn't until the 3rd century that, with the rise of the Roman Emperor, like Tertullian, when early Christianity departed from Judaic roots like Shema and started embracing more Platonic ideas.
That's right.
That later writers like St. Augustine or the prominent others that Professor Patterson mentioned yesterday. It wasn't until that time when it started embracing, these Platonic doctrines that these writers started maligning Judaic roots, and it was in that malignment of Judaic roots that bred to modern anti-Semitism, to the point where, to mention the Church of England, I think the Roman Catholic Church especially, with Tertullian when he started, mingling with Christianity in the 3rd century, the Roman Catholic Church, of which Tertullian was the de facto head when it started, to this day adopts every church as its daughter churches, save one, which is, de facto Messianic Judaism, because they held to the roots that they were not going to embrace these Platonic beliefs that led to anti-Semitism. So it's especially if you want like further clarity, you can read writers like, as he mentioned yesterday, writers who believe more or align more with premillennialism and are therefore more aligned with Israel, supporting Israel. These Christians are don't necessarily support anti-Semitism, but they're more definitely aligned with see Israel as the roots, or to those to whom the oracles of God were, you know, given, and are more embracing of these, you know.
Yeah, I'm not sure what your question is, but I'm going to
It was a comment.
A comment, okay. I don't, yes, I appreciate your comment, and I did not want to suggest that the New Testament is inherently anti-Semitic. I think the question is, what was done with it over centuries? And sometimes, you know, it's hard to make the differentiation because it's gotten so in the weeds and so in the roots and so in the culture. But the last thing, I don't think anyone who is, to say that someone who is raised on the New Testament is ipso facto going to be an anti-Semite. I do think there were serious problems, you know, talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Not until Vatican II do you have acknowledgement that the Jew of today is not responsible for what the church believes happened, you know, 2,100 years before, 2,000 years before. So there have been real problems with how it has been. But in terms of whether that is the essence of the church, I'm not saying that at all. So with that, I'm going to end because no one should ever stand between you and lunch. So.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we reconvene at 2:30.